Welcome back to Proxam, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to fight against Necrons as Craftworld Eldar. So, Necrons are one of those factions that have been kind of a menace since Nephilim. They've gotten new secondary objectives, which are very easy to score on, and they've gotten point deductions basically across the board on their most powerful and important units. So, Eldar players, as a result, are having a bit of trouble keeping up with them. And it's not just Eldar, it's everybody. Every single faction in the game is having at least a little bit more trouble dealing with Necrons than they did previously, as Necrons were often considered one of the worst factions in the game up until that point, sharing places with Imperial Guard. So, what we're going to be talking about this video is how to reverse that for the Craftworld Eldar. So what we're going to be looking at in this video is what makes Necrons so tough for Craftworld Eldar to deal with, first of all. Second of all, we're going to be looking at a few common units and abilities that you will find in most Necron armies, and the Craftworld Eldar units that are effective against them. And lastly, we're going to be talking about some strategies and tips for dealing with Necrons on the tabletop, so that you can better fight them and have more knowledge about them. And when talking about what makes Necrons so tough for Craftworld Eldar to deal with, it's really a couple things. It's really three things. First of all, they're far stronger at scoring victory points on primary objectives and have really easy secondary objectives. Eldar do not score well typically on primary objectives, especially the take and hold. And their secondary objectives, although very doable, are more resource intensive than the Necron ones. We have to spend a lot more resources scoring on our secondary objectives versus the Necron secondary objectives. Also, damaged units in the Necron army can reanimate, reviving models that were previously destroyed through their reanimation protocols. It used to be called Will Be Back, which was a reference to Terminator, if you guys, a little bit of trivia for you guys out there. And the units that are in the Necron army now are very cost effective with the buffs they recently received. So they didn't receive anything wildly spectacular, but across the board they received damage reductions. Kind of in the same way that Eldar received points increases, Necrons received point decreases on a lot of their units, making them much, much tougher to deal with, meaning there's more units on the table, and meaning that they're very much harder to deal with. Especially when you combine that and stack that with the fact that they can revive models and that they're already super good at controlling objectives. More units always makes an army better at controlling objectives, basically. So why exactly are Necrons far stronger at scoring victory points on primary objectives than Craftworld Eldar? Well, it really comes down to the fact that their units are extremely tough, with all the reanimation abilities and stuff like that that they have access to. And they also have army abilities that allow them to get to and take hold of objectives much easier. And what I'm talking about here is some of the custom Tomb World abilities that they have, which include relentlessly, expansionist, and internal conquerors, which I'll talk about in a second, and why those make it so easy for Necrons to score on these points. And also the secondaries are extremely easy to score on because they go right hand in hand with the primary objectives. And I'm talking about the Treasures of the Eons, Purge the Vermin, and of course, Ancient Machineries. So Relentlessly Expansionist is one of the, basically if you think about it in Eldar terms, it would be like a custom Craftworld trait, right? And this gives all units within the Necron army that have the correct code a 6-inch pre-game move. So some of the units within the Necron Codex won't be affected by this, but a vast majority will, much like our custom Craftworld traits, and Craftworld traits in general. And this 6-inch pre-game move is great for getting up the board and onto objectives to hold before you can do anything about it. Now, Eldar have a few units that can do this, but we do not have an entire army that can do this. Now, most of our units are very fast, but when you're talking about the objective game and getting to objectives, this is a great way for a Necron army to kind of get around their slow speed by getting a free 6-inch movement in the beginning of the game. And the thing about this 6-inch pregame move is there is nothing stopping it from being within certain range of your units. So you could not, for example, use Rangers to block this move at all. In fact, this might actually just end up giving the Necrons more movement because they could just assault you and then consolidate after. So again, this really speeds up an otherwise very slow army during their first turn. The second trait that is kind of problematic and really powerful from the objective standpoint is Eternal Conquerors. And basically this gives all unit with that code objective secured. And if they already have objective secured, which by the way a lot of Necron units do, Necron Warriors and Immortals are something that you'll see quite often in Necron armies, then they count as 2 models for determining control of objectives. So just imagine trying to steal an objective away from Necrons when they have quote-unquote 40 models on it, and there's so many models on it that you can't even fit on the objective, first of all. And second of all, even if you could fit on the objective, you're just going to get out-muscled by the sheer amount of models that are on there. You're just never going to win an objective from a Necron player with this ability. And this makes a faction that's extremely good at taking and holding objectives even better at it. So again, and this isn't just for things like Necron Warriors, this is for every single unit with that code. That's Tomb Blades, that's Stalkers, that's basically anything in the army, everything, including characters, have objectives secured. This is extremely powerful, and this basically ensures that the Necron army is always going to be one step ahead of you when it comes to the objective game. Not only do they have access to these really powerful army traits, but they have secondaries which are very easy to score on. So the first one is Treasure of the Eons. This gives extra victory points for controlling objectives, which is something Necrons want to do anyway. And they score points at the end of their turn, so they don't actually have to wait until the next turn to score. So there's no chance to get it back before they score. Now, there is a light at the end of the tunnel for this objective. It is so easy to score on, and I think the writers of this really saw that, and they gave the chance for your opponent, so that means you, as a Craftworld Eldar player, to choose which objectives to select for your opponent. This allows you some room to make it a little bit harder for them to score. You can select objectives that are far away from their lines or closer to your lines, as long as they're outside of your deployment zone. Unless, of course, there's no more objectives in no man's land, in which case you could technically select an objective within your deployment zone, but most of the missions have enough objectives in no man's land to where this is going to be impossible. So basically, my advice for this one is try to deploy them obviously on the side of the board that you're going to concentrate your forces on. This is going to make it harder for the Necron player to actually break through your lines and be able to score extra points on these. And of course, I think it goes without saying, whatever you do, do not choose the objectives, if possible, that are closest to your opponent's army, because they will get on them very quickly with those relentlessly expansionist and eternal conquerors, special rule army rules, and they will just stay on that objective for most of the game unless you really go hard after it in some sort of coordinated strike, which is possible, and I will talk about that later in this video. The next secondary objective they have is Purge the Vermin. This basically encourages you, so that means a Craftworld Eldar player, to spread out so the Necron player doesn't score big every turn. But the Necron player can also kill those units if you spread too thin. So this is scored at the end of the Necron turn, which means that if he kills your units within those board edges or those board corners, then he will score on these objectives. And that really just doesn't do anything good for you. So good units to kind of contain this are Vipers and Swooping Hawks. These are really good at getting to different board edges and hiding from Necron units so that they can't actually shoot you, so that you can deny them those points. But you have to also be careful. This secondary objective is a big trap for a lot of players when they hear it, because they think, oh, I have to spread out my forces to reduce the amount of victory points the Necron player is going to score. And while that is absolutely true, you do not want to spread your army so thin that you have no chance of actually fighting the Necron player effectively. Remember, Eldar units work good when used in concert with each other. If you are spreading really thin, then you are not working to the advantages of the army, which is Craftworld Eldar are very good at fighting together in coordinated assaults. So you also have to be careful about that, and my advice would be to try to use your Rangers to eliminate the possibility of your opponent scoring really high on this in the first couple turns of the game. In the later turns of the game, your opponent is going to be scoring points on this, and there's not really much you can do about it unless you plan to sacrifice other things. So my advice is, if you have Swooping Hawks, Vipers, Rangers, use these kind of units to control the board, which they probably would, let's be honest, do anyway. And don't take away your damage-dealing unit's ability to deal damage and perform coordinated strikes by using them to spread out to deny your enemy points on this objective. Now, this objective is going to score your opponent quite a few points, but again, the second part of this is that if there are no units in the enemy deployment zone, and that's something Eldar are very good at with Vipers and Swooping Hawks. So in a lot of cases, you can mitigate the amount of points that your opponent can score on it just because you have the nature of being a fast faction, which is great. Craftworld Eldar are very fast, and we can get a lot of units around the board easily, but just don't concentrate on it. Use, again, like I said, use units like Swooping Hawks, Vipers, and Rangers to do this. Don't use your damage-dealing units. And the last secondary objective, which is a huge problem, is Ancient Machinery. So this is basically a far superior version to Scry Futures that does not require a psychic test and earns more points. It's very easy for Necrons to get at least 12 points on this with very little effort. All they have to do is walk up to an objective within the first couple turns of the game, perform this action, it completes at the end of their turn, especially if their objective secured, which most units will be in the army. And then they score points on it for the rest of the game. So it's not like something like Raise the Banners where you actually have to sit there and hold it for the entire game, pretty much. This is something where you have to just walk up to it, complete an action, you got the points. That's it. It's that simple. And you can do this within the first couple turns of the game without too much trouble. It's very easy to get 12 points on this, and most Necron players will score that 12 points within the first couple turns of the game. It's very powerful. And to be completely honest, there's not much that you can do about it. And I say that in just full truthfulness. I wish there was a way around this, but if you go second, your Necron player goes first and gets to those objectives early, there's really no way to stop it effectively unless you just kill the entire unit. And even then, another unit can just take its place and easily score on it at the end of their turn. So expect that the Necron player will get at least 12 points out of this, probably minimum. Unless the game is just going really, really bad for them, or they're a new Necron player who's not really playing for the objectives. The next reason why Necrons can be hard to deal with is because they have damaged units that can reanimate, basically reviving models that were previously destroyed. So as long as the unit is under starting strength, there are several things that Necron players can do to resurrect their models. And these include the reanimation protocols, which are an army-wide special ability, the resurrection orb, the ghost arc, and the technomancer. So probably the most well-known out of these is the reanimation protocol. So basically what this means is destroyed models resurrect on a 5+ after enemy units shooting and melee attacks go through. This can be improved to a 4+ through several abilities and things like this. However, it cannot activate on destroyed units. So I would think of this kind of like a feel no pain save in a way, except in some ways it's a little bit worse. Because if a unit is destroyed as a result of an enemy attack, the reanimation protocols do not activate. And on top of that, multi-wound models need to get as many 5+ as they have wounds to resurrect. So Tomb Guard, for example, which have, or I shouldn't say Tomb Guard, I should say Lich Guard, have 2 wounds apiece. If one of them falls, they would need to get 2 5+ to resurrect. And not just one, as would normally be the case for larger units like Necron Warriors, Immortals, etc. And basically, this adds a huge layer of durability to an already tough faction. Most models in the Necron army have a pretty decent armor save, and they also have pretty decent toughness. So they are fairly hard to kill already, and this just makes them harder to deal with. And of course, there's the age-old Resurrection Orb, which is more powerful than ever, which fully resurrects the damaged unit to full strength in the Necron's command phase. This is potentially game-winning if used on a very damaged unit. For example, could you imagine a unit of 2 Necron warriors being revived from 2 models to 20 models? That is potentially game-winning and theoretically can make up way more points than the Resurrection Orb costs in the first place. Now, the good news is that you can only use the Resurrection Orb once per game. That's the good news. The bad news is that it fully revives a unit to full strength, which means that it's more important than ever to make sure that units are fully destroyed when you're playing against Necrons. Then they have a few lesser resurrection abilities through several units. The Ghost Arc is one of them. It resurrects D3 Necron Warriors a turn. Only Necron Warriors, nothing else. And it's a pretty big transport that occupies a lot of space. You typically don't see these in lists, but if you are playing against Necrons, the Ghost Arc is a semi-common sight in more casual games. And then you also have the Technomancer, which resurrects 1 Necron core model or D3 Necron warriors, depending on what unit you target. The Technomancer is also a decent choice, and honestly, pretty popular. It has some pretty good abilities outside of resurrection, but this is just kind of a little extra thing that it has. On top of their resurrection abilities, the units that Necrons have are very cost effective with the buffs they recently received. Most of the units in Necron Codex received significant point decreases, making them much more cost-effective and hard to remove on the table, and just meaning that you have to get through that many more models to be able to successfully clear them off of objectives and things like that. So, a few common units and abilities that you will probably find in most Necron armies are as follows. So we have the Necron Warriors, which are your basic troop choice. We have the Tomb Blades, which are kind of like a jet bike, Necron version of a jet bike. We have the Locust Destroyers, which are a close combat-oriented unit. We have the Silent King, which is a Lord of War, very powerful. And lastly, we have Locust Destroyers, which are essentially heavy gun platforms. When looking at the Necron Warriors, their base stat line is fairly unimpressive, but they're very durable for the cost and can be taken in large units. They're great for holding down objectives as well, and because there's so many models that potentially can be in the unit, they're good at preventing enemy units from capturing through sheer weight of bodies. When you combine this with the, I guess you could say, their equivalent of Craftworld traits that we talked about earlier, like Eternal Conquerors, it can be extremely hard to impossible for you to remove a Necron unit off of an objective without significant, and when I say significant, I mean very significant investment. So, a lot of players may be asking, well, what are some counters to Necron Warriors? It seems like they're just really tough and I have a hard time breaking through them. So some units that are good against them are Warp Spiders. Warp Spiders are very good because they have a high strength weapon with a lot of attacks that have the blast keyword. So against a unit of 20, you're going to be getting your max number of attacks. Even a unit of just 5 Warp Spiders is going to be getting 30 attacks, 36 attacks if you give the Exarch an additional Death Spinner, which is probably going to be what most of you are going to do anyway. And that's going to do some significant damage to the Necron unit. If they're on an objective, chances are they're not going to be in terrain, and they're only going to be getting a 6+ save against those attacks. Especially when combined with buffs, this can really do a lot of damage to them. Psychic combos with large units are also very good to try to make sure that you can do as much damage as possible to try to destroy the unit outright to get around its reanimation protocols. Things like Guide, Doom, Jinx are all very effective at reducing their ability to survive. And lastly, offensive psychic powers ignore reanimation protocols. Things like Executioner, stuff like that will actually ignore that. because reanimation protocols only activates after a shooting or close combat attack is made. And to be honest with you, a lot of units with a large volume of high strength firepower can be effective at taking these guys out with the right buffs. You just need to make sure that when you do try to take them out, you make sure you take out all the models in the unit, even if it means a little bit of overkill. The next unit that's been very prevalent in competitive Necron play are Tomb Blades. And that is because they have a high toughness and durability, especially with the upgrades that they have. They can get, not only do they have innately -1 to hit, but they also have an ability to get +1 armor and an invul save, which makes them very tough. And they're also very fast by Necron standards. They have movement 14, and they have very good anti-infantry weapons. So what are some counters to Tomb Blades? Well, not surprisingly, shuriken cannons, right? A max unit of buffed Wind Riders with shuriken cannons can blow another max unit of Tomb Blades off the table before they can reanimate. If you put Guide and Doom on the unit of Tomb Blades, they will be no more by the end of the turn. Even if they have an invul save, chances are you're going to be able to kill every single last Tomb Blade in that unit. Now, if you don't have that, weirdly enough, Star Cannons are also fairly effective against them because they basically ignore their armor and they have damage too. And lastly, if you don't really have any of those tools available, normal shooting works just fine against them as long as you concentrate your firepower, or you can engage them in close combat. They're extremely weak in close combat. They only have 1 attack apiece, so any combination of Howling Banshees or Wraith Blades, Shining Spears, Striking Scorpions, whatever, will absolutely wreck them in a couple rounds of combat without suffering too much retaliation. I actually really like Shining Spears into these guys because when they charge in, they can get a shooting attack before they go, and then they can finish them off in close combat so they don't get the reanimation protocols. With the right buffs, a unit of Shining Spears can run through these guys in a single round of combat. The next unit that's been seeing its way in the tournaments is Locust Destroyers. So looking at their basic stat line, these guys are really fast. They have really good toughness with toughness 5 and 3 wounds. They have a 3+ save, and they have devastating combat potential at a reasonable price point. They're only 30 points apiece, which was recently reduced, I believe, and they get a lot of attacks. They have strength 5, -3 AP with damage 2 weapons, and they get an extra attack. So that's a lot of high strength, high quality attacks going into enemy units. These guys are fantastic at mostly killing Space Marines. I think they're a little bit overkill against Craftworld Eldar personally, but these guys are very effective in general. They're very fast, can close with you quickly, and they're not too hard to hide. So what are some of their counters? Well, Warlocks with Singing Spears are fantastic against them. Offensive spells and debuffs can really weaken them considerably, and the damage 3 on the Singing Spears kills them outright. Plus, they always wound on a 2+, which ignores their -1 to wound stratagem that they'll often use to survive in combat, so that they can use their reanimation protocols and resurrection orbs and things like that. Warlocks are very effective against them. Wraith Blades with Ghost Axes and Force Shields are also very good because they're resistant to their attacks and can deal significant damage back. The -1 damage means they're only going to be dealing 1 damage on average to them, and their invul saves mean that their high AP value is not going to matter much. And also, Locust Destroyers without their stratagem will pretty much be wounding on a 5+. And lastly, D-Cannons. Locust Destroyers love to hide behind line-of-sight blocking terrain until they can close in with enemy units and rely on their reanimation protocols and different resurrection abilities to be able to survive indirect fire weapons. However, D-Cannons, because of their high strength AP and the fact that they ignore line of sight and do multiple wounds, will absolutely devastate a unit of these guys. They will not get an armor save against most of their attacks. The D-Cannons deal mortal wounds on top of that, so these guys will be really hurting after a round of shooting from a D-Cannon support battery. And then we come to the Silent King, the Lord of War. This monster unit has 26 wounds total with a 4+ invul save, extremely high toughness, immense shooting potential, great close combat, The Silent King, that is, not his Miniers. The Miniers are absolutely awful in close combat. And the Silent King gives a plethora of buffs and army bonuses that are extremely powerful. Now, the biggest counter to the Silent King is Fire Prisms. Fire Prisms will ignore the invul save of the Silent King. They do insanely high damage, and you only need one prism to have line of sight. Typically, the Silent King, if he can, will try to hide behind true line of sight blocking terrain, and I don't mean obscuring terrain, I mean actual buildings that block line of sight totally, because it has too many wounds to be hidden by obscuring terrain. So, with Fire Prisms, it's very easy to get a direct line of sight to them and use that linked fire ability to basically blast them off the table. D-cannons are also very effective. They have high strength, AP, does mortal wounds, and they ignore line of sight, meaning that the Silent King will either have to stay out of their range or suffer heavy damage. And the Silent King wants to be fairly close to friendly units, so that's not something that's always going to be available. Eventually, the Silent King will have to move within range. And in either of the above cases, it will most likely, unfortunately, take you multiple turns or units to bring it down. It's just a fact, right? The Silent King is a very powerful unit. They have a lot of wounds, 26 wounds combined. You're not going to be able to take it out in a single round, but in a couple rounds of shooting, either Fire Prisms or D-cannons can definitely take this guy out. And lastly, we have Locust Destroyers, which are a common sight in more casual games especially. They have heavy long-range damage and can reposition very quickly. They have 3 wounds apiece and toughness 5, which means they're not that easy to kill. And their weapons are pretty good. They have gauze cannons, which are very tough weapons and can do a lot of damage to light tanks and heavy infantry. So, what are the counters to these guys? Melee. And yes, seriously, they can't shoot in combat, they're infantry models technically, and they have awful combat stats for how expensive they are. If they get stuck in combat, they're going to have a terrible time. They're never going to make up their points worth. Wraith units are also fairly resistant to their shooting and can devastate them at range or in close combat. Wraith cannons kill one with every shot, and Wraith blades can dominate them in close combat, obviously. And lastly, most strength 6 and above ranged weapons with buffs can also kill them off fairly effectively. They're not that tough. They do have a lot of wounds, especially when used in a large unit, but the problem with them is that they don't have any armor of contempt or anything like that, so high AP weapons or just weapons with a lot of strength and maybe a jinx thrown in there can really do a lot of damage to these guys. So, the good news is that we have a lot of tools to deal with a lot of the Necron units, and a lot of our tools are units that we use in a lot of different armies, right? D-cannons, fire prisms, shuriken cannons, scatter lasers. We use these in a lot of our different armies. They're common. They're not niche picks. However, this is not all there is to Necrons. Unfortunately, Necrons are a faction that are very good at playing the objective game, which means they don't really care if you kill their damage dealing units. They're going to try to score as many points as quickly as possible in the first couple of turns so that you can't really catch up easily. So, what are some strategies and tips for dealing with the Necrons on the tabletop? First of all, try to weaken a unit a bit first before delivering the killing blow. When you deliver the killing blow, you're basically deactivating their reanimation protocols. So it's often a good idea to weaken a unit first. And when possible, try to finish off units entirely to prevent resurrection abilities. Stay concentrated in a few areas of the board and be aggressive. You don't want to let the Necron player take the advantage in that. The Necrons are slow and you are fast and aggressive. Use that to your advantage to press the attack on them so that they can't push farther up the board. And whatever you do, do not try to outmuscle Necron units for objective control unless you can guarantee that you will wipe out their units on that objective point and be able to capture it with no resistance. So what that means is, unless you can guarantee that a large part of your army is performing coordinated strike and you know that the Necrons won't be there next turn because you have so much invested into it, do not try to outmuscle them on objectives. So when I say weaken a unit a bit first before delivering the killing blow, reanimation protocols only activate if the unit has not been destroyed after an attack. So try to whittle the unit down a little bit first, down to a size that you can then eliminate with one of your buffed up units, a unit with Guide or Doom or something like that. Next, if you're looking at a unit of 20 Necron warriors to shoot, try shooting your smaller units at the Necrons first before finishing them off with something bigger. For example, you have a couple of units of Swooping Hawks or minimum units of Dire Avengers, try shooting them first before shooting at them with your buffed Shroud Runners or full unit of Warwalkers or something like that, right? That way you ensure that you eliminate as many reanimation protocol rolls as possible. And when it is possible, try to finish off units entirely to prevent resurrection abilities. Necrons have an insane amount of resurrection abilities, but they cannot bring a destroyed unit back to life. Thus, it is better to completely destroy a unit altogether than do a bit more damage that is spread out. So, for example, it's better to kill 10 Necron warriors in a unit completely than kill 7 in one unit and 6 in another, because of those reanimation protocols and numerous resurrection abilities. And also, try to stay concentrated in a few areas of the board and be aggressive. To fully wipe out Necron units and take objectives from them, you really need to utilize the coordinated strikes, which I go over in another one of my videos, but it basically means you need to use a lot of different units to gang up on one unit and one part of their army. And this is going to require a concentration of forces, so don't sit in your deployment zone either. Use your speed to your advantage to get up the board quickly and strike first and put your opponent on the defensive. When you force your Necron opponent on the defensive, they're going to be much less able to get to those objectives that they need to in the middle of the board to score all their points. Because once they're there and once they fortify and bunker down, there's not much you can do about it without investing an insane amount of points to do so. So, prevent them from getting there in the first place and take the fight to them. Lastly, use counter reserves to show up when your opponent takes backfilled objectives. There are certain units in the Necron army that have deep striking abilities or are very fast. Use your counter reserves to show up when your opponent does this to try to take those objectives so that you can respond to them, right? Because if you're on the defensive or offensive in their side of the field and they take your backfield, you're pretty much in the same position. So make sure that you use counter reserves to your advantage. And of course, do not try to outmuscle Necron units for objective control. Most Necron units are going to have objectives secured and more models than you do. So efforts to contest are extremely unlikely to succeed, as they are with other armies, right? So, for example, if you charge a lone unit of Wraithblades into a Necron warrior unit on an objective, you will never succeed in doing anything productive, and in fact, you'll be feeding right into the Necron advantage. That unit of Wraithblades will most likely be in combat with that unit of warriors for the entire game, and you will really not kill a whole lot, and in return, that Necron unit, even though they won't kill you either, they're going to be scoring points on that objective every single turn. So you really need to make sure that if you do strike an aspect or a side of your opponent's army, that it is a complete coordinated strike and that you can eliminate that unit of warriors. So in conclusion, the main reason why Necrons have skyrocketed to prominence in Nephilim is because of their insanely easy to score secondaries and cost reductions, and the fact that they were already pretty good at dealing with the primary objectives. However, if you keep your damage elements together to perform coordinated strikes and eliminate units completely, and use your speed to outmaneuver the Necrons rather than to play to their strengths, you stand a much better chance of victory. And oftentimes, if you utilize these strategies, you can eliminate a Necron army fairly quickly, because a lot of their defensive capabilities will be shut down with proper planning and maneuvering. Alright everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. If you think I missed anything in this video, please do leave it in the comments. If you have any tips about how to deal with Necrons, please leave them in the comments. Or if you have any additional questions that you didn't think I covered in this video, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to answer those questions for you. Alright everybody, that's going to be it for today. I will see you guys next time. Peace out. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.